Hello, David. Hi, Thomas. It's nice to see you. Thanks so much for making time for me today. I know you're very busy with the recent publication of your inquiry. How are you otherwise? I hope the life of a bachelor still agrees with you. It does indeed, Thomas. I can think of no alternative arrangement that would make possible pursuing my varied interests. And yourself, Thomas, how is my favorite common sense philosopher getting along these days? I am well enough, David. I published my first paper this year, an essay on quantity and quality, and I've begun research for my first book. It's with this development in mind that I have begged the favor of your time today. Perhaps we can begin our discussion with what has come to be known as the theory of ideas. Would you please explain the origin and development of this empirical hypothesis about the operations of the mind? Happy to explain, Thomas. As you know, the new science of Newton has provided a very precise explanation of the order and action of things in terms of force acting on composite matter. So this account assumes a principle of locality. And that principle states that an action at a distance is only possible with a series of mediating actions. The theory of ideas is concerned with the mediating actions that must exist when we perceive a remote object. Here's an illustration. An external object emits sense particles which arrive to our sense organs. So these particles mediate the relation between the external object and our visual sense organ. But what's arrived to our visual sense organ is still remote from our understanding, and so there must be something subjective which mediates between our sense organ and our understanding, and these are our sensations and our ideas. These sensations and ideas mediate in the operation of our mind by giving us representations for our understanding. We are immediately aware of our presently existing sensations and ideas. We are indirectly aware of the objects that are represented by our sensations and ideas. David, isn't the theory of ideas based on an analogy of the interaction of two physical objects? Certainly the laws of physics require a mediating existence between two physical objects, but the mind is not a physical object, and ideas cannot be anything like particles of matter. Why are ideas even necessary in an account of the operations of the mind? Oh, you misunderstand. Ideas are not necessary because of the composition of physical matter. Ideas are necessary because any account of reality needs to be put in terms of actual particulars. Here's some historical context for what's known as metaphysical realism. Philosophers and scientists are of a consensus now in questioning Plato's real universals. We now hold only the existence of real particulars. Newton and the materialists were concerned with physical particulars. We philosophers have been mainly concerned with mental particulars. Newton was an objective nominalist. We philosophers are subjective nominalists. And the actual mental particulars which we are concerned with are the presently existing contents of our minds, our sensations and ideas which are representations for us. To take one more step, the division of nominalism into its subjective and objective versions raises the question as to whether an account can be given that explains the interaction of physical and mental particulars. Descartes, Leibniz, and Locke think they can give such an account. I disagree. On my view, all we can know with certainty is the existence of consciousness and presently existing ideas and sensations. I do not deny the existence of physical matter. It may exist, but we are cut off from any certain knowledge of it. You say you can give an empirical account of ideas. You must have evidence that ideas exist. When I reflect attentively on my own experience, I do not discover anything like mental items in my consciousness. I am certainly aware of many different kinds of acts of consciousness, but not many different kinds of particular mental items. What evidence do you have that such mental items, such ideas, exist? Here's a certain proof. When we move away from a table, what we see changes in size, becoming smaller and smaller, and yet the actual table is not a thing which is changing. Therefore, what we are directly perceiving must be a changing thing and not a changeless thing. So what we are directly perceiving when we see the table changing cannot be the table itself, but rather a succession of different representations or images of the table. That is, a succession of sensations and ideas of which we are immediately aware. Let us put the argument of your proof into logical form so we can examine its validity more closely. The minor premise is all that we see when we move away from a table is that which changes in size. The major premise is nothing that changes in size is that which is a real table. And the conclusion is, therefore, nothing that we see when we move away from a table is that which is the real table. So it must be an idea. Your argument contains an ambiguous middle term. In the major premise, that which changes in size refers to the changes of a real object, a real table. But in the minor premise, that which changes in size refers to the appearance of a real object. A changing appearance of a thing is not the same as a real thing which is changing. Your argument equivocates different senses of its middle term, and so really it has two middle terms. Valid arguments only have one middle term. This is not a proof for the existence of ideas. Your objection begs the question against my position. I do not hold any assumptions that we perceive objects which appear to us in different ways, and so therefore have the same reality as their objects. I maintain that all we perceive are sensations and ideas, and that we take these to be representations of objects which we infer to have a separate existence. What you call the appearance of an object with one and the same reality, I call an idea with a separate reality from any object. All right, let's move on. You say we do not directly perceive the table. We directly perceive sensations and ideas which represent the table and its qualities to us. Sensations and ideas must be representational in their nature. They must be like signs. They signify or represent something else. By what operation of the mind or principle of understanding is representation or signification accomplished? Sensations, ideas, and their objects are linked together in the understanding according to a principle of association, which includes three relations: resemblance, contiguity, and cause and effect. In the example we've been discussing, the idea I have of a table is related to the image or sensation I have of the table by a principle of resemblance. And what about sensations? How are sensations representations of their objects? Does the sensation or image of a table resemble a real table? No. The sensation or image of a table does not resemble a real table. It can't. It is perfectly clear that sensations and ideas as mental realities cannot resemble the physical properties or objects of material reality. Rather, our sensations represent their objects by a different relation, that of cause and effect. We understand our sensations to be the effects which are caused by external objects. It is interesting that you explain association of ideas by means of natural relations. Resemblance and cause and effect are relations which we normally speak of with respect to physical objects, not mental objects. So once again, we have conspicuous use of notions from the physical sciences incorporated into a psychological theory. Nevertheless, even if the legitimacy of these relations is granted, this still does not fully explain how sensations and ideas can be representations. Suppose a real table causes a sensation, and suppose this sensation is a mental image. How does this mental image become a representation and not remain simply an image? How does this sensation come to represent something other than itself as an image? The answer must be that I interpret a mental image to be a representation and not just a mental image. And how do I make this interpretation? I must have a prior conception of what is being represented. It is impossible for something to be a representation without what it represents being involved. Indeed, a prior conception is presupposed in any representation, and so no representation can explain a prior conception. And since the theory of ideas assumes all sensations and ideas are representations, the theory does not give a satisfactory account on its own terms. Here's the refutation in argument form. The theory of ideas explains all acts to be presently existing sensations and ideas. All sensations and ideas are representations. All representations presuppose a prior conception. A prior conception is not something that is presently existing as an idea or sensation. Therefore, not all acts of mind are presently existing sensations and ideas. I do not know what this thing you are calling a prior conception can be, if not a presently existing idea. I will grant you that the principle of association, which I have defined in 3 relations, may be incomplete, and that other relations may exist which give a better explanation of how representation works in the understanding. But I don't think this in any way diminishes the theory's most important insights about perception and the understanding. David, it seems that the theory of ideas is a weak hypothesis at best, and it's probably false. It seems to have been modeled on the mechanistic physics of matter, despite dealing with the non-material reality of the mind. There is no evidence that I can find for the existence of ideas. The theory does not account for all of the operations of the mind which must be involved, even on its own terms. And the theory flies in the face of common sense. No one but a philosopher would take seriously the suggestion that all we perceive is our own ideas. So, allow me to suggest a more plausible alternative. The many errors in the theory of ideas are the result of vague terms and obscure definitions. What we perceive is not the same thing as what we are conscious of. An act of consciousness is not the same thing as an object of consciousness. Sensing is not the same thing as thinking. And not all acts of mind are reducible to a single act of perception. So let's begin by distinguishing sensation from all other acts of mind of which we are conscious. When we are sensing, we are having a feeling of red or cold or hard or sweet. This is not a feeling of anything that is independent from us. The what we are sensing is the sensation itself within us. Sensation is its own object. All other acts of mind are directed towards independent objects. We conceive of triangles. We imagine dragons. We remember directions. We judge testimony. We believe in God. So sensation by itself carries within itself no reference to an external object. For sensation to be involved in a knowledge relation, which we know it is, sensation must be conjoined with acts of mind that are object-directed. By principle of human nature, 2 of these acts are constantly conjoined with sensation, conceiving and believing. When sensing, conceiving, and believing are conjoined, this is properly termed perceiving. In these conjoined acts, the conception and the belief contribute the cognitive content of the perception, what its object is, and the object's mode of existence. And the sensation contributes the phenomenal quality of the perception, the feel of it. Here's how the operation works. When we have a sensation, the feel of a table, for example, it is immediately followed by something completely different, a conceiving of the hardness of the table and a believing in the table's present existence. This movement of thought from sensation to conception to belief happens so quickly, it is, to use a metaphor from the physical sciences, reflexive. This is not a learned behavior, and there is no reasoning or inference involved. By a principle of human nature, our awareness passes from our sensations over to conceiving and believing about real objects. By now it should be obvious how my theory of perception avoids the many problems which arise in the theory of ideas. First, my theory accounts for sensations in perceptual knowledge without the circular reasoning that sensations are somehow perceived. Second, My theory avoids the explanatory complexities of representationalism. Sensations are not mediating or representing anything. And third, my theory is not bound to a counterintuitive mechanistic framework for how the mind works, but is more true to common sense about our actual experience. Thomas, this is a very interesting and certainly very elaborate theory you have developed. I do have some questions. In this conjoining of three mental acts, sensation, belief, and conception, is sensation a fully conscious act? In other words, are we conscious of our sensations when we are perceiving? And are sensations causally required for perception? Yes, we are conscious that we are sensing, that we have a feeling. And yes, perception normally involves some sensation or other, so I will grant that it is required, although I add the qualification that it is a contingent and not a logical requirement that perception involve sensation. So, on your view, sensation is a distinct conscious act involved in perception, and sensation is required for perceiving an external object. This means that sensation is something that is internal to the mind and that we must take as an object of awareness in order to perceive external objects. We cannot get around being conscious of our sensations. They stand in the way of our understanding. So, our perception is mediated by an object of consciousness after all, namely our conscious sensations. It seems we've arrived back to the place from which we set out, and that what you were describing as something special about sensation really adds nothing more to how sensations are accounted for in the theory of ideas. David, I grant you that sensations are conscious acts and that perception occurs by way of sensation. Sensations as conscious acts co-occur with acts of conception and belief. And in this sense, they are intermediary, and they do, so to speak, stand in the way of understanding. But on my view, sensations are not constitutively intermediary. Ultimately, they are not making any contributions to the understanding of what is perceived and how what is perceived exists. This is not their operation. So this is clearly a very different sense of intermediary than that implied by the representational sensations in the theory of ideas. In that theory, sensations not only stand in the way of understanding as intermediaries, they stand for and as the objects of understanding. So I think my theory remains clearly distinguished from the theory of ideas. David, we've reached the end of our time together today. Thank you for the discussion. You have given me a lot to think about. It will be incredibly valuable for me as I begin writing my book. Thomas, the pleasure's been all mine. Very best wishes to you for all success in your scholarship. Bye-bye. Goodbye, David.